kind of sick to take these actions in such a playful way, to derive pleasure from attacking. So we asked the question, what did Jesus do wrong? What was Jesus' crime? Why would these people attack? And notice it got ramped up. It says that they became more vehement in verse 10. You know what his crime was? He was a threat. He was a threat. There were some people in that crowd that he was a threat to their way of life, to their way of thinking. He was a threat to their wallets. He was a threat to their influence. He was a threat. He was a threat to their mindset, their way of thinking. He was a threat to even their approach to God. He was a threat. And when they saw this threat even growing and increasing, they reached a point where they had enough. So they go on the attack. And they accuse. And they notice that they twist things. They twist what he said. They twist what he did. And it's interesting that the Jews, in verse 2, were such good of the Roman leadership. You notice in verse 2, I'll read it again. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perplexing the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar." They were so concerned, these Jewish leaders, that Caesar wasn't going to get his taxes. That'd be like some of us in this room, being so concerned about the taxes being paid, right? When normally we're not big fans of it, right? We're normally not big fans of it, but all of a sudden, this is the lengths that we'll go to accuse. That will end up creating partnerships that are very, very humorous. Matter of fact, in verse 12, after the Jews sent him to Pilate, and then they sent him to Herod, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But notice verse 12. That very day, Pilate and Herod was this kind of despot, this kind of joke of a king over the Jews, even though he was a puppet for the Romans. It said that very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other. For previously they had been at enmity with each other. So this is that same phrase, you've heard this phrase maybe before, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's this weird uniting, this common enemy. And we've seen it, haven't we? Where sometimes there's a problem, and then you end up these two people, these two groups who normally don't like each other. They unite because they have a common enemy. And so they accuse Jesus of being a bad citizen, forbidding to pay taxes, saying that he was a king. He was offensive to the Romans. He was offensive to the Jews. He was a threat. But as Pilate examines him, in verse 4, Pilate says to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." So there was nothing that Pilate could really put his finger on that was worthy of convicting him of a crime. It's not a crime to be a threat. It's not a crime to be a challenge. And so Pilate says, I find no fault in him. He says it again in verse 14. He said to them, you have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things which you accuse him of. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him. And indeed, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. So, Pilate, Herod, they've rendered judgment. They say there's no fault. The Jewish leaders, they're vehemently accusing, attacking, twisting. When in reality, Jesus had done nothing wrong. So here's a note for all of us. I just actually said this to somebody. They're sharing a situation before the service. They're talking about arguing with people. And I said this to them. Before you argue, you better make sure you're right. Before you argue, you better make sure that you're right. Not just believe that you're right, not just convince yourself that you're right. You better be right. You better be right. Because you think about these Jewish leaders, they're getting all worked up, they're getting sweaty, spit's flying out of their mouth. They're yelling, screaming, they're being demonstrative. But they're wrong. But they're passionate. They must be right. Well, you can be passionately wrong. They were wrong. As the leadership examined Jesus, no fault. But I think part of the reason that Pilate and Herod didn't just get on board with the mob was that, and here's a principle, most people don't care until they're personally threatened. At that point in time, Jesus was not a threat to Pilate. He was not a threat to Herod, because remember, that was Jesus' crime, was that he was a threat. And so Herod plays kind of with Jesus. In verse 6 it says, Then Pilate heard of Galilee. He asked the man if he were a Galilean. As soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him and had hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but Jesus, he answered Herod nothing. He was like, that's quite an indictment on Herod. Jesus is like, Herod, you're such a joke, I'm not even going to answer you. The chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. They're just like, come on, Herod. They're trying to force Herod into taking an action against Jesus. It says, then Herod, with his men of war, treated Jesus with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him with a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate as a joke. And that very day they became friends. They enjoyed this joke that they shared together. So he goes back to Pilate. Pilate gathers up everybody. He called together the chief priests, the rulers. He renders his judgment. No fault, nothing deserving of death. Verse 16, then I will therefore chastise him and release him. For it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. So they have this feast. They have this tradition. during the feast that the Roman governor, that he would release one prisoner. It's kind of this token of goodwill with the Jews. So he's like, here it is. I've got it made. This guy has nothing wrong. This is kind of nice. It works out. I can turn them over. They'll get their little tradition thing, and it'll all be good. Easy fix for Pilate. Easy fix. But verse 18. And they all cried out at once, saying, away with this man, and release to us Barabbas. Description of Barabbas in verse 19, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. You know, this is not unlike cancel culture today. This is not unlike cancel culture. And this is also not unlike our answer to the first question I asked. What is the worst thing that somebody can do? You know, if I were to travel around with a roaming microphone, and I were to ask that question, and I would have you give me your answer out loud of the worst thing that somebody could do, there's a really good possibility that some of us in this crowd would say some really heinous things, right, that somebody could do. But there's also an equal probability that some of us in this crowd would say something that others of us in this crowd would seem pretty small and unimportant. That we would feel like pale in comparison to the answer that we would give. But a lot of us would think it's the worst thing because it's been done to us. Simply because it's been done to us. It's interesting. And when Pilate was ready to release Jesus, the crowd actually asked for a murderer instead. So therefore, what the crowd is saying is that for some reason, what Jesus was being accused of is actually worse than murder. Would you agree? Would you agree that what Jesus did was worse than murder? Would you agree? Okay, I'm asking questions. A lot of y'all ain't answering me. Was what Jesus was being accused of, was it worse than murder? Yeah, what he was being accused of. But it's worse than murder? But they didn't say that part there. It's funny how we can make a bigger deal of some things and not other things. Isn't it? Especially the things that are a threat to us. And the crowd, they start to get unhinged. Verse 20, Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them like, listen, there's nothing wrong with this dude. There's nothing wrong with this guy. Just let me release him, and they get, verse 21, but they shouted, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And then he said to them a third time, why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him, beat him, and let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. Why? How? How could they get so worked up about this? Why would they push things this far for this? How could they make the things that Jesus was being accused of somehow worse than murder? And I can tell you, even for myself, I'm maybe not convinced that murder is the worst thing that somebody can do. But I know a lot of things that seem a whole lot worse, a whole lot less worse, a whole lot more minor than murder. But they drove it to the point of cancel him. They had to make stuff up, twist words, take stuff out of context, create victimhood. And I imagine, for some at that point, they were like, whoa, this is going a little too far. We didn't think it was going to go. We just wanted the guy smacked around a little bit. This mob remorse, you could call it. But things got so heated and so chaotic. Verse 24, so Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. You think things got so out of control, now it's a threat to Pilate. This is threatening to be a major headache for Pilate. So Pilate's like, I need to do something. Just give in. Verse 25, and he released to them the one that they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. He's like, you want the murderer? Here's the murderer. And interestingly, what were the two crimes that Barabbas committed? What were they? Insurrection, rebellion, and murder. What was Jesus being accused of? No, what was he being accused of? What was the constant refrain? Rebellion. The very same thing. That was what they were saying at face value. So that they got someone who was actually doing it let go. And the guy who wasn't doing it, they had convicted. Do you see how messed up a mob can get? This should be a good warning to us before you join a mob. Before you join a mob, you better figure out what this thing's about. And where this thing's really headed, and what's really being said, and what's really being desired, and what's really happening. We better figure those things out before we join a mob. Because people will recruit us to mobs, won't they? Somebody gets threatened, somebody gets their feelings hurt, something's done, and we go talking, don't we? We go recruiting. We go recruiting for people. My feelings were hurt. Can you believe it? Oh, you're upset too? Good, you're on my team. Who's next? That's what we do. We try to build a mob, and we twist things. I remember one time, this is stuck in my craw. No, just kidding. I remember one time I was preaching away, and afterwards I found out that somebody was going around telling people that I said Jesus was a sinner. And I'm like, what? I have never said, nor will I ever say that. That is offensive to all of my theology, that Jesus was a sinner. Jesus was perfect. Even Pilate knew it. that there was no fault found with man. So I was like, wait a minute, what? I don't understand. And I was thinking back through the sermon I was preaching, and I was like, I didn't even come anywhere close to that. Listen back to the message. It's always good to be recorded, so you can do that, so you have proof. And so, but here's how it happened. Here's how it happened. I was preaching the passage where Jesus got into the disciples' boat. And I was kind of using that to talk about this, because Jesus didn't ask permission to get into the disciples' boat. He just got into it, and he kind of surprised them by that. And then I said this: Jesus will sometimes trespass. Jesus will sometimes trespass into our lives. That he will go into areas in our life that we don't want him in. And what this person did was take that and to say this: Mark called Jesus a sinner because trespassing is a sin. I'm like, what? What? Wait, how did you get there? But yeah. And they were fully convinced, and they were recruiting for a mob. Things can get so twisted. Things can get so twisted up and out of control. Whether it happens to us, or even, God forbid, we do that to someone else, where we connive. We figure out how we can do some gymnastics with their words in order to put them in a bad light. Jesus forbidding to pay taxes, which was absolutely contrary to something he did, a miracle that he performed. In all this chaos, in all of this confusion, in all of this twisting and maligning and conniving, here's one thing that we cannot lose sight of. Whether we are the accused, the played with, or we, as I said, God forbid,